Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey folks, today we're going to take a look at Orphan Black, the card game from IDW Pandasaurus Games. This is, of course, based off of the, I don't know if it's like super popular, but definitely a cult hit amongst geeks and nerds, the show Orphan Black. And also IDW, as you can tell from the cover, has done a comic book version of this as well, just for your information, and hence that's why they have the rights for the game. In the interest of full disclosure here, I've watched 2 seasons of Orphan Black. I think there is a 3rd season, maybe even there's a 4th one that started. I'm not really sure. I checked out after the 2nd season. I like the concept of the show, but there are some really cheesy things about the 2nd season. It just couldn't hold my interest, and I was pretty much done with it. But I know a lot of other people stuck with it and really, really enjoyed that 2nd season. If you're not familiar with it at all, it's a sci-fi show set in the modern day, but where there is a secret organization that has developed cloning technology. I don't want to say too much and spoil too many things, but I'll just give you the basics. They've developed cloning technology, and there is a set of clones. There's like many clones of the same woman or the same child who became many clones. It's a whole convoluted thing. The show focuses on one of those clones, Sarah, and how she discovers what's going on. There are actually clones of her out there, and they all have different personalities because they grew up in different settings, different accents, different sexualities, all of these different things. There's a transgender clone, there's an evil clone, and all of that type of stuff. And there are these different organizations, the Proletheans, the Neolutionists, and the Black, who are nominally the good guys, maybe kinda, who are trying to sway the clones from one side to the other. That's the basic premise without giving away, like, intricate details. And how the card game works is that essentially you are trying to be those organizations and manipulate the clones to your bidding. You'll have secret goals of clones that you want to manipulate towards your faction, so it'll tell you what faction you are. You can accuse the other players in order to get extra points. There's special effects cards, a whole lot of stuff. The game is actually surprisingly complicated for what it is. So let me go ahead and give you a brief look at how the game is played. Then we're going to come back. I'll let you know what I think. Okay, I'm going to give you a brief look at Orphan Black, the card game. This is a competitive game for 3 to 6 players. The goal of the game is to have the most points at the end. The end of the game is going to occur when you have run through the entire deck of clone cards and there are no more clones left to influence, which I'm going to explain in detail, don't worry. Now, in general, what the theme of the game is, whether you've watched Orphan Black or not, there are all of these clone women and one man, a transgendered man, who are constantly being influenced by these 3 different factions. You're going to set up this triangle of faction cards in the center of the table: the Neolutionists, the Proletheans, and the Black. So you're going to be placing the clone cards next to these cards and trying to sway them to each different faction. The reason for that, and the reason why you care about which faction they go to, is because at the start of the game, amongst other components, you're going to get your little scoring sheet here, which lets you tell you where to put different cards and gives you a cheat sheet for scoring, but not for turn order, interestingly enough. But you'll have a faction target card. This is going to be dealt out to you randomly. You deal them out in a very specific way, just to make sure that there's like a distribution of cards such that there may be a couple. There's like 2 of every faction potentially in play, but you'll keep this secret. You're going to look at it at the start of the game, and then put it face down next to your sheet. And these are your targets. These are the 3 clones that you want to influence the most, because you're going to get bonus points at the end of the game if you do so. And along with that, it will tell you which faction you belong to and which faction you're trying to get those clones to go to. So for instance, if this was me, at the end of the game, if I could get Sarah Cosima, I always say that wrong, and Crystal to go to the Black, to be, absorbed by the Black, then you are going to get an extra 2 points for each of them, and that will determine what your faction is. The other reason why this is important is because of the accusation cards. Every player is going to get a set of accusation cards. Now, you may not need all of these, depending on how many players are in the game. Again, it goes from 3 to 6. But these are cards that you're going to use during the game if you think you have a reasonable expectation of what a player is, like what faction they belong to. So, for instance, if I really thought that the black player, I don't remember what those Greek symbols are, but if I really thought that this black player was a Neo-Lutionist, then during my turn, at a certain point during my turn, I could place one of my accusation cards. I always go with whatever the highest point value available is. It goes 3, 2, 1, 1, 1. Again, you're not going to use all of those depending on how many players are in the game. So I could put my accusation card there, and if I'm correct at the end of the game, I'm going to get 3 points. If I'm wrong, however, then that player is going to get 1 point for every wrong accusation that's been put against them, and I've used my card for no reason. So a large part of the game is trying to look at what players are doing during the game and trying to figure out what faction they belong to. So all of that is a convoluted way of saying that you get a score sheet, a set of accusation cards, and a random target card. You're also going to set up the scoreboard over here, which you're not really going to do anything with yet until the end of the game. There are scoring markers for each of the different players, the different symbols, which are all on the back of all their cards. And then you have a scoring marker for each of the different factions. That's because as you go through the game, as clones go to each faction, they're going to earn points for the faction, not for the players. So let me show you one of the clone cards just so I can tell you what I'm talking about. So there's Sarah, who of course is the main character of the show. And we'll go through all of her stuff later, but at the bottom you have the different symbols of the factions, and it's really hard to tell, even if you're in real life, but there are a different number of symbols, of Greek symbols, on each of the different colored symbols, and that will tell you how many points you earn for that faction if that clone goes to that faction. So if Sarah was to go to the Neo-Lutionist would score 2 points. If she goes to the black, which is her faction, she just gets 1 point for that faction. So in other words, if the Neo-Lutionist took her, you would move the faction marker up 2 spots. Why is this important? Because at the end of the game, when everyone reveals what faction they belong to, you're going to score points equal to wherever your faction marker is. And remember, multiple people could belong to the same faction. So every Neo-Lutionist would gain 2 points at that point. However, if there were multiple factions, multiple people on the same faction, you have to cut the points in half because it's an unfair advantage to the people who are for that faction. So, in other words, if the Neo-Lutionist had gained a total of 4 points, you would cut those points in half, and that is where every Neo-Lutionist player would start off at, and then you would get the rest of your points. There are a few other things to explain about scoring, but it's not going to make any sense until I go through the rest of the game. This game it's a little tough to explain, as you can tell. So, other setup things that we need to do. You're going to have a deck of influence cards, which you're going to shuffle up and put off to the side. I'll explain more about those in a moment. You have this triangle of faction cards. According to the number of players, you're going to choose a start player, the active player, and then each player is going to take one clone from the deck. We'll start off with Sarah here. Put it next to its appropriate faction, like so, and then draw 2 cards from the influence deck. Now, you're actually going to start off with 3 influence cards separately in your hands, but those aren't going to be used now. Instead, you're going to draw 2 brand new cards. Only you're going to look at them. You're going to choose which card is going to go on. One card is going to go on one side of the clone. The other card is going to go face up on the other side. You decide where each card goes. So the players are going to have some information, but they're not going to know what the other card is that you played face down. Now, there's 2 types of cards in the deck of influence cards. There's numbered cards, like the ones that are here, that very simply have numbers from 1 to 3. That's all that's on the card, and all of these are doing are influencing the clones towards one faction or another. When there are 6 total cards, meaning you add up the cards on both sides of a clone. When there are 6, right after you resolve the action of that clone, which we'll get back to in a minute, then that card is going to pop. You're going to resolve that clone, so to speak, and you're going to shuffle up the cards on each side and reveal them, and add up the total numbers of cards. If the total number of cards, if the difference between the 2 cards, so let's say there was 6 points on one side, 3 points on the other, and there's 3 left over. If that threshold, if that number beats the threshold on the clone, then that card is going to be moved. So, for instance, Sarah's threshold is 2. That's what the number is right here. So, if you can get 3 or greater of a difference on one side or the other, that clone is going to move to the other faction. If not, if you cannot meet the threshold, it goes nowhere. So in other words, if it's 0, 1, or 2, nothing's going to happen to that clone. It's incredibly unlikely that it would be 0. Well, no, actually it could. Again, it's the difference of the two total sum values. And when a clone does go to one of the factions, when 6 cards are out there, whether it's the same faction or one of the others, it's going to get stowed underneath that card, and you're immediately going to score the points, like I explained before, for that particular faction, and nothing else is going to be done with it again until the end of the game. You'll put out another clone to replace it. Now, the other type of card, and then when you're out of clones, by the way, and you can't resolve anymore, then this is going to be the end of the game. The other type of card that could potentially be in the deck are the character cards. Now, the character cards, if you choose to play them down as an influence card, which could be during the opening setup, again, every player is going to do this, or it could be during the course of the game, they're going to count as 0, that they even have it on the card. It's a 0-cost card for influence. However, at the start of each player's turn, they have the opportunity to play that for their character action. In other words, they just play the card, use its ability, put it into the discard pile, and in some rare cases it will be placed next to the influence card. But let's go ahead and take a look at those right now. So they're all characters from the show. You have Felix, although interestingly enough in the rulebook they have Fee, which is what Sarah calls him in the show. So I'm not sure if that was a joke or if one of these is a typo. I don't know. But it's funny. So Felix is look at a card, switch it with one from your hand or not. So you look at one of the cards down on the table and then switch it or not. Art is you look at one accusation card. So when players are putting accusation cards on each other, you can look at one of them anywhere. Dr. Leaky, the card you place face down this turn can activate any clone's ability. Paul, play face up on one side of a clone. Cards on the side with Paul cannot be moved. Donnie, you give this to the target, and on their turn they must show you which card they are playing. Then they may discard this card. They usually will. Delphine, look at any opponent's hand and take one card. Mrs. S, play on a clone, increase the threshold by 1 for this clone. And Mark, the next player must play on the same clone as you on either side. So, going back, just for expediency's sake, let's just say this was a 4-player game, so 4 clones are going to come out. The next player in turn order, this is still the setup, is going to take 2 cards, put one of them face up, one of them face down. Again, the character cards count for nothing. Actually, we'll go ahead and put 6 out here. So there's Rachel. Here's Allison goes here. She's in the black card. So let's just say this was like this. Again, it's a different player doing it each time. So you have to watch what they're doing and see if it gives you any kind of clues. Oh, wow, I'm putting them all in the wrong places. I apologize. I'm just doing this totally randomly for no reason. So, all right. So, okay, this is what it might look like in a 6-player game because you've got 6 players and they are all putting out cards, influence cards next to each of the clones. And this is just a setup. As you can see, it's already really crowded. This game takes up a surprising amount of table space. So once you're done with the setup, every player's put out their cards. You're going to go back into turn order, starting with the active player. Again, you will have a hand of 3 influence cards to start off, and then you're going to begin. So the first thing you can do on your turn, optionally, is play one of your character cards like I just explained. Take a character card from your hand, put it in the discard pile, and that's it. By the way, if the influence deck ever runs out, you reshuffle, and then players can continue to draw from it. The next thing you must do is play one of your influence cards from your hand face down next to one of the clones on either side. It's your choice. You can play a character card face down if you want to. You can play a number card, whatever you want. Now, after you play the card, you then activate the ability on the clone wherever you happen to play. And they all have different abilities. So, for instance, Cosima's has a threshold of 1. It's kind of hard to see with that light blue background. But she lets you look at 2 cards. You simply look at 2 cards. No problem. Whereas Rachel says you lock a card. That means you can physically turn a card sideways and nothing can happen to it from that point. Players can't manipulate it with their character cards or the other clones, which is really useful to keep things in check. Sarah, again, the main character of the show, her ability is to swap 2 cards and then flip one of them afterwards, which by our interpretation means that you can even flip a face-up card back face down. Allison's ability lets you flip 2 cards. Then you can, let's see, You've got Tony, who's the transgendered clone. His ability is to look at a card and show it to one other player. And then Helena's card, without going over there, I think that's the one that lets you look at a card and potentially remove it from play. You can actually kill the card. Then you have the option of... I'm sorry. Actually, I should point out that at this point, if any clones have 6 cards on them, you resolve them. So there's actually one other clone that lets you play multiple cards. So if multiple clones on your turn happen to all pop at the same time, you'll resolve each of them by doing what I said before. Shuffle up the cards on each side, reveal them so that each player can't tell which player played what card, reveal them, add up the numbers, see if the threshold was met, and then you'll draw a new card along with 2 more influence cards, one on each side, face up and face down, just like in the setup, to replace it until you can't put any more clones out, and then you deal with the rest of them that are actually still out here. Then you have the option of playing your accusation cards. If you don't use them before the end of the game, they're gone. And if you don't use them early enough, you're not going to get very many points potentially for them. The final thing you do on your turn is draw your influence cards back up to 3. So you can't have more than 3 in your hand. You'll just draw back up. And each player is going to do this, taking your turn, possibly playing characters, putting down influence cards, using the clone's abilities, trying to resolve each of the clones in their favor so that they are going to go to the faction that's going to get them the most points. Remember, you want your targets to end up in your character faction. So if I was in the black, I'd want Sarah to end up in the black. And also, I should point this out too, every one of the target cards for each faction, like there's, I think, 3 or 4 Neolutionist cards, every one of them has Rachel. Like every one of them is going to have one clone that's common to all of the target cards for that faction. So the black target card has Sarah, and every Neolutionist card has Rachel, and every Prolethean card has Helena. But the other 2 that targets are going to be kind of random. It just kind of depends. So once you get to the end of the game and there's no more clones left to resolve, then you're going to get to the scoring, and that's where things get a little bit confusing. So you're going to flip all your goal cards face up and see who met their particular goal. Or more specifically for now, you're just going to see who belongs to which faction. Then you're going to divide the scores in half for any factions that have 2 players. So you look at the faction marker tokens and see which factions have 2 players and cut the score in half at that point. Then you're going to go player by player and flip over all your accusation cards and award points, which is going to be if you guess the correct accusation that's in the 3-point slot, you get 3 points. However, every wrong accusation against that player gives them 1 point and you get nothing. Then for every player, you get 2 points for every target clone that's actually in the correct faction, your faction. And then you get the 1 point for every card that was put against you incorrectly. At the end of all of that, whoever has the most points at the end of the game is going to be the winner of the game. Phew! For a card game, that is surprisingly complicated. Now, let's get to my final thoughts. All right, we'll start off talking about theme and components. The theme is close to the show-ish. This is one of the things about adapting any kind of other written work or televised work or whatever it is to a board game. People ask me all the time, Nick, what's your favorite anime and which anime of your favorites would you want to see made into a board game? And I always respond, some of my favorite anime I would never want to see as a board game because it wouldn't make any sense. Because all of the shows that I love are very character-driven. And that's how I feel with Orphan Black. And I know that I was critical of the show, but what was best about the show were those characters, were the clones, and to a lesser extent, the people that they interacted with. By the way, in case I didn't make this clear in the intro, it's one actress playing all of the clones, and she's masterful. That's what's best about the show, and seeing all the different personalities that she can act as with those clones. So they're taking the faction part of the show, which is interesting, but is also sort of just background noise in the show to a degree, and blowing this out into the whole board game. And really, it's just like, hey, we have the rights to Orphan Black. We need to make a game with it. So, we'll do the thing with the factions. So the theme is not that strong. Although I will say, if you really love the show, you can get echoes of the theme in the show here. There's things like the cards make a little bit of sense and what their powers kind of make sense. Like Felix, Fee. I still think it's funny that the rulebook and the card actually say 2 different things, the nickname and the full name. But he can distract some players, and the monitor, Donnie, he can make the other player show their card. Okay, fine, but that's about the limits of the theme here. As far as the component quality, I wish they hadn't used still shots. I always say this about games. They're high-quality still shots, and it is at least good that they've got like a nice full headshot of each different character, but it's on like a bland background. They're not doing anything interesting in the shots. All the game is very bland and dry, metallic gray. The symbols are really annoying because in the beginning, it's very difficult. The first time I taught this game, and by the way, I've had to teach this game several times now. I'm done teaching it. It's very hard to teach. It's really annoying to teach to new people. But each of the factions has multiple symbols on the clone cards, and that's hard to see. So, and then it's just confusing with all the different symbols, and it doesn't help that the game is just not that easy to teach. So, and again, the game just looks kind of bland. I wish they had used artwork like from their comic book series. That looks great. That would have made the whole game pop, which I know is a graphic design term I shouldn't use and everyone hates, but it really would have made it look better. So, not really thrilled with the components. But what about the gameplay? That's all that really matters, right? Well, there are really good parts of Orphan Black. The good parts that I like, Orphan Black, the card game. What I like the most is the whole aspect with the factions, ironically, even though I think it's kind of pasted on. But that whole thing of trying to figure out which player belongs to which faction, that actually kind of trumps whatever's going on with the clones out on the board, because those are just take that elements. You're playing cards down to each of the clones, and you're playing characters from your hand, and all it is I swap cards, I steal a card from you, blah, blah, blah. I've seen this all before a million times. The actual turn-to-turn gameplay of this game is kind of a slog. It's really not that interesting. Trying to deduce what the other players are, however, and also the whole thing at the beginning of getting your targets and playing the accusation cards on each player's turn, deciding when to do that, that's pretty interesting, as well as seeing how the clones resolve. That's the exciting part. When the clone finally resolves, like, okay, let's see how it goes. That is exciting, as well as even the end game scoring. The end game scoring is extremely obtuse. That's, again, hand in hand with teaching the game. It's just a lot of confusing things like, okay, the faction markers move up, but then you got to split it in half because there's two people from the same faction. It all makes sense, and it all works. It's just very convoluted sounding for what is essentially a very simple card game. But the end game scoring and how it all pans out, again, is pretty interesting to see how everything actually shook out, which clones ended up in which spot, and so on. But to get to those interesting bits, to get to the bits of the intrigue of the factions and to see how the final scoring is actually going to work, it's just kind of not mindless card playing. There is strategy to be had here. You want to look at what the cards the players are putting down are. If you can, try to manipulate that threshold to the best of your ability. But at a certain point, there's not much you can do sometimes. Like, for instance, if you are trying to influence a clone, which two other players have decided they're trying to get to a completely different faction because they happen to be of the same faction, you're probably screwed, which can be quite frustrating. So you have to sometimes just sort of gnash your teeth and not give up on fights in order to do something somewhere else, which has the potential to be interesting, but again, the actual gameplay of putting down cards, not that interesting. It also is true that, again, you can, the cool part about the game is putting down the accusation cards, but once all of the accusation cards are out, once players have put down all their stuff, or even if you in particular have, you have lost half of your incentive to do any kind of bluffing or subterfuge. Up to that point, it's interesting to see if players are bluffing. If you put a card over on this side face down and it's just a character with zero influence because you really want it to go in the other direction, or if you don't care about that at all and you're just trying to keep one player in check so that and give points to another player, that is interesting. But once all of your influence cards are down, you lose half of your reason to do that. Now it's like, well, or once you've got all of your influence cards, or accusation cards, I should say, because at that point, it's like, well, I don't care what people think about me. They've already all accused me. I can just do what I want. The only bit of subterfuge at that point is making them second-guess themselves. Like, oh, maybe he's not actually of that faction, and maybe he actually wants this clone to go this way or that way. But, again, at a certain point, especially if it gets getting down to the crunch time, it's kind of like, I got to get this clone over here right now, and you're just going to play your highest point stuff and your lowest point stuff on other people's things. So it can be very anticlimactic at that point. So this is definitely a mixed bag of a game. I certainly appreciate what they went for here. It was way more... I don't want to oversell how elaborate it is, but it is kind of dense getting through it all. And they definitely had ambition here with how it all plays out. I do like the fact that you are accusing other people, trying to figure out who's with what faction, and then the big reveal at the end, or even just the smaller reveals of the clones resolving. But to get to all that stuff is quite a chore. Explaining the game, sitting down and playing cards down on each faction, the game is way longer. The box, I think, says 30 minutes, does it? 30 minutes? Not even close. No. I've played this with 4 and with 6 players. With 6 players, I mean, the time difference isn't very big between those gaps because you're putting down more clones in the beginning, and there's just more out there to see and to manipulate, but more abilities in play. But you're looking at 90 minutes to even 2 hours, depending on the experience of the players involved. So that's another box whose time is a lie, I think, an outright lie, unless you all have played the game 100 times. And with that amount of time, it's just not that exciting in between those reveals. So I think this, unfortunately, it seems like I'm kind of bullying IDW at this point, but I spent my own money for this game. I was very excited to try it, even though I was kind of lukewarm on Orphan Black at this point. But I don't know. They just keep being misses for me. This one isn't nearly as bad as some of the other games I played from IDW. It's still competent. Some of the people that I played it with definitely had a lot of fun with it, but they were also really big fans of the show too. And I think that's going to be the pivotal point here between you overlooking some of the warts that the game has. So that's Orphan Black, the card game from IDW, Pandasaurus. Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.